All right, so I'm going to get. All right, here we go. Welcome back, everybody. It is time for another edition of the NautZone. Yes, you are with us in the NautZone from Sportsnaut, our NFL show where we give you news and views from around the league. Scott Gulbransen with Ryan Dyrud. And as we get on the air tonight, as you can see from behind me, if you're watching on video, I went to UNLV. And of course, bad news today as there appears to have been an active shooter on campus. My son goes there. Luckily heard from him, but just a shout out to all of our folks in Las Vegas as we hope for the best in this situation. Just terrible, terrible news and hits home. And we hope that everybody keeps those folks in your prayers as they figure out what's going on there. So just a quick note off the top of the show for that. I hate to start with a bummer, but it's important and wanted to make sure we talked about it. All right, now we're going to get into the NFL. And today, Scott Gulbransen, by the way, your host here. I'm an editor, writer at Sportsnaut, also the host of Silver and Black Today, covering the Raiders. And I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, and that is Ryan Dyrud from the LA Football Network. He covers everything Los Angeles football. If you're not familiar with that, make sure you check it out. And you can follow him on x.com at Ryan Dyrud, LAFB. You can follow me at LV Gully. And the show is NautZone. All right, there we go. We got all those particulars in. Ryan, man, I'll tell you what, the NFL, we saw the Chiefs-Packers, right, Sunday night. We saw the blown calls, if you want to call them that. Oh, well, they're Hail Marys. They don't call interference calls. And listen, the Chiefs have gotten their share of home cooking since Patrick Mahomes came in the league. So I'm not defending that the Chiefs don't get calls. But it underscored again, I believe, and I think we've talked about it in passing here on the show, how bad officiating is in the NFL right now, and that there doesn't seem to be any desire by the league to do anything about it. Now, Roger Goodell, every time something like this happens, defends the officials. I get it. Defend your folks. Go behind the scenes and fix it. We're going to get into this conversation, but I want to get your view off the top. Do you feel is it gotten worse, or do we just look at it and see it more so we think it's worse?
That's what I was going to ask you. So I'm glad you asked me that because it's a great question, one that I think about and hope you're doing well and happy to be here. But, I think it's probably I don't even know if I'd say a combination. I think it's more so that we now have so many different camera angles. Everyone a clip is on Twitter or X just like that we can all view. And so, like with most stuff in life, we're able to dissect things from so many different angles and so much quicker that it makes it seem like it's so much worse than it ever was. But in reality, I think it's probably better than it ever was. Just in the past, we couldn't see what went wrong. We would just take their word for it. Like, oh, okay, that was the call. It was what it was. Or you see one like grainy video replay and you're like, oh, probably a bad call, but what is it? Like, we don't, now we have you can literally see the grass come up when their shoes, if they're inbounds or not. Like we didn't have that even 5 years ago. So I think it's probably not worse. It's just the fact that we have so much more access, so much more technology. Now, with that being said, because we have so much more access, because we have so much more technology, it should be that much easier to get it right. And it maybe not even right immediately, but now we can make it right. And I know they tried this, and this is what I'll throw back to you to ask. When they came out with the rule that you could challenge pass interferences and it only lasted a year, what are your thoughts on that? Is that something we need back? Was it so bad that year that it should never come back? Like, what's your thoughts on that we can kind of challenge these things?
Yeah, I think I think you have to try things and see what works and doesn't. So to your point about the pass interference thing, we saw in the league's view of that, right? And the numbers showed kind of it didn't work, right? Or it wasn't making a big enough difference. And the rules committee for the NFL is really sometimes a black box. Now, we've heard Roger Goodell, he makes a lot of money for a reason because he pushes narratives and they work. The thing with the hip drop tackle, which we'll address in a different show, but the hip drop tackle, of course, now the tush push, Philly special, whatever you want to call it, that they're already signaling they're going to get rid of. And so clearly the league starts sending signals of what they're going to do. I think with this one, you're just seeing inconsistencies, and a lot of it doesn't make sense. And I agree with you. I think a lot of this is because we can see everything, right? You can see blades of grass. There's cameras in the pylons, for God's sake, right? So you can see things that you've never been able to see before. So that brings new scrutiny, and that's okay. But what seems to not work is the fact that the league just refuses to say, well, no, we need to get better, or we need to do this, or we need to do that. It's just kind of like, nah, well, whatever. And I feel like they do that because they are the 800-pound gorilla, right? They don't have to, hey, you guys are record, the Monday night game with the Bengals and the Jaguars, not exactly big markets, was the most watched Monday night football game in 13 years, I think it was, right? So it's something crazy like that. So they kind of feel like, well, yeah, you guys all complain, but you're still coming back. It's like your food is terrible, but you keep coming in and buying it. So I'm just going to keep serving the same food, because why would I increase my cost or do anything different? I think that's part of it. But I do think that the replay related rules changes, they have them every season. But what they don't have, I think, is I like what the USFL did, right, with the Sky Judge, or was that the XFL? I can't remember now. Now they're one.
Yeah, with the little remote control.
Right, with the remote control, and I think here too, this is where we have now, and maybe it would put these guys out of business, like the Dean Blandinos on Fox and all that stuff, who are former officials who comment during games, and God bless them. Hope they keep their job. But if you had more transparency, Ryan, to say that, hey, when they make a call, the Sky Judge, or whatever you want to call him, head official for the game, tells you why. Hey, here's why, what we saw, here's what. At least you would get the thinking behind it. And then it's not to the announcers, mostly who are ex-football players and broadcasters, who then try to expound and give you a reason why. We would actually hear from the NFL official. So I think there's some of that piece of it, and the replay officials' authority. They've tried so hard not to step on the toes of the guys on the field. When we see, I think with certain crews, I think it's clear that some of these crews are not as good as others, because you see penalties and things like that. So that's sort of my take on it so far.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And, as much as we'd like to be able to review every single play, I mean, you just can't do that. Each game's going to last 7 hours. So, but one thing, and this is what I'll give the league credit for, and this is where these officiating crews, whether, I'm not saying they need to get punished, they're fined or anything like that, but whether they get held more accountable is another conversation. But the league has done some things in regards to making specific plays automatically reviewable, right? Like they just, that everyone remembers, not that long ago, not every touchdown was reviewed. That's now changed. Every scoring play is reviewed. Every turnover is reviewed. Change of possession reviewed. So now it's, and this doesn't go into pass interference necessarily, but now it's getting these officiating crews to always err on that side. And I think, for instance, think back to this, that, I don't know if you remember, but that Rams-Steeler game in week 5 or whatever it was, with the missed conversion, had the officiating crew called it turnover on downs, they would have automatically reviewed it regardless. So they could have seen if it was or it wasn't. But because they called it a conversion, Sean McVay had no more timeouts, so he couldn't challenge it. It was just above the 2-minute warning. It was like 2 minutes and 8 seconds. So it couldn't be into that under 2 minute thing, but they could have had the turnover on downs automatic review and got it right. So I think it's just having these crews learn, like, let's always err. And we see it more now in fumbles, right? Like there's some that are clearly incomplete, but they call it a fumble so they can review it. I like that. That's good. Let the play go. They'll get it right afterwards. And so I think it'll just take time, them doing that more. And the turnover on downs review is I think it's new just this year. So that's a newer one.
Yeah.
But whether it's punishment or getting less credible games or whatever, to get these crews to always err on that side, I think that'll at least help.
No, I think that's absolutely true. It's a good point. But I do think that if at the end of the day, it's about getting it right. Right. So if we do a show here every Wednesday, as we do, by the way, make sure you subscribe to the channel below. Every Wednesday we do a show. If I come on and I say something, if I give a statistic and it's wrong, and you come back and tell me it's wrong, okay, it's wrong. Let's make sure it's right. And I think with the NFL officials, this is part of the issue, is they've been very reluctant. That's why I love, it wouldn't solve everything. There's not one solution, Ryan, that's going to solve every bad call or controversy call. It just can't. It's not possible, right? But something like a Sky Judge, and I'll use an example the other night, the Monday night game, it appeared at one time Joe Mixon crossed the goal line and he was not down, right? They called it. Bengals didn't challenge it because you can't challenge. There's nothing to challenge. It wasn't a score. If they would have called it a touchdown on the field, they would have reviewed it. and he was either in or he wasn't. But if he is in and he doesn't get it and they spot him at the 4-inch line like they did, there's no recourse there, right? But if I'm somebody up in the sky who looks at it and determines without indisputable evidence, right, that shows that he crossed over, why shouldn't I be able to chime in and say, whoa, wait a minute. That was a touchdown. You guys just missed it. But I could see it because we have all the camera angles. You're a human. You're on the field. You're going to make mistakes. That's okay. So that piece of it is what's interesting. And you're right. We can't extend the game longer and longer and longer by reviewing everything. But I also think that the rules position here, Ryan, is a big deal, which is, can you tell me still what a catch in the NFL is? Because I can't figure it out.
No clue. And I played receiver, and I don't have a clue.
Right. So I think that the rules committee, and again, I'm not saying it isn't easy. It's easy for us sitting here with microphones on YouTube to talk about, well, you should do this, you should do that. But if you can definitively define something that so there's no question on whether it is a catch or not, now every catch will be different, but I think the catch rules are so crazy. Every time you see a ball in somebody's hand in the end zone and it comes out right afterwards, there's this, oh my gosh, was that a catch? Was that not a catch? Well, here's what the rule says, and the rule doesn't really define it. So I think the rules committee, because of the increased scrutiny too, should look at these things and determine, okay, what can we do to do better? What can we not control? I mean, it's a crazy game. Stuff happens, right?
Yep.
But what can we do to instill confidence in the fans, coaches, and players that when we make calls, we're going to make the right ones. And if we don't make the right ones and they're egregious, we have a way to correct that, right? To me, that's it. And again, no perfect system.
Yeah. Yeah. And you said it at the top. And unfortunately, the NFL and Roger Goodell are very full of pride. And that's kind of their one downfall. And, you know, I do a Bible study podcast with my dad, and our episode this week was on humility and stewardship, which is so ironic coming to this. And if the NFL, like you mentioned it with the XFL knocked it out of the park with how they did some rule changes and with the transparency with officiating, like home run. I think everyone loved it. It did good for the league. The games weren't any longer because they did things very quickly. They were actually quicker because of different play clocks and stuff. And the NFL needs to say, that works. Let's adopt that. But they're like, no, we're the NFL. We do what we want. We make the rules. And so I don't know if it'll ever change. I know they say they're trying. They do all these different meetings in the off season, but you know, I mean, they'll just keep getting talked about and keep getting views. So I guess it's okay.
Yeah, exactly. But that's what I don't understand, because the NFL invested money in the USFL, right? And now both of them are combined with the XFL. So they obviously have been watching the Sky Judge thing. And if they don't think it's viable for a certain reason, I'm okay with that too. But explain to us why it's not. It seemed to work well there. Okay. Yeah. The stakes aren't as high, obviously. But if it doesn't work, tell us why and say, hey, we're going to continue to do this. But it goes back to, I did a story on Sportsnaut earlier in the season about artificial turf. This was after the Rodgers injury. And what I discovered was instead of putting money behind how you could do grass and improve turf, the NFL has been developing its own turf, this monster turf they call it.
Sounds about right.
So they've been investing. So they're investing in making their own turf while people get hurt. And there could be an opportunity. There's other people who've come up with systems that work where you can use grass inside, all this jazz. And so to your point about pride, absolutely. And that's the thing is, until their pocketbooks are hurt by it. And I don't think it'll happen in the short term, Ryan. I really don't, because the NFL is a juggernaut. Okay. But over time, that erodes people's confidence. And somewhere down the line, you will see it. And they do focus group after focus group after focus group. So eventually it'll peak above a certain number, and then they'll pay attention to it. I mean, I think that's the reality.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't really know if it will ever hurt their pocketbook. So we may be having this conversation for a loop of a lifetime. Who knows?
Yes, because the bad calls, especially if you're on the wrong end of it, if you're a fan of that team, guess what? Your passion is, you might hate it. Will you ever abandon your team? You may eventually, if you really get pushed to the point where you just don't care anymore. But most people, it will just fire them up. They'll want, Roger Goodell, he loves to be booed. He doesn't care. He just means people are invested. That's all about the green, baby. So we'll see what happens. And of course, it was fresh in my mind because of the game the other night. So we'll see.
Yeah, it was. I will say
before we move on.
I'll just say, because you said it. If something like that does happen in a team, though, I'm okay with it happening to the Chiefs. just because of how much they do get away with. I mean, even just the 2 plays before that, they call the late hit on Pat Mahomes when he's clearly in bounds. So
shoulder to shoulder.
I'm not, obviously we got to be unbiased here.
Yes,
it was a terrible missed call, but if it happens to any
absolutely.
team, it's okay to me that it happens to the Chiefs.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously have a lot of friends and listeners for our Raiders show who like you hate the Chiefs. They also hate the Broncos, which obviously is your team, but the same thing. And yes, the Patrick Mahomes hit, I mean, it's another good example. That's an example of, yes, protect the quarterbacks. By the way, quarterbacks, and we're going to talk about it in the next segment too, quarterbacks are more injured now and they're more protected than ever. So you can see that while you got to protect the quarterback, I get it. Running a shoulder into a guy who's in bounds, how that's a penalty, it's maddening. And yes, certain teams get them more than others. The Chiefs, the Steelers, a bunch of them. So, all right. Speaking of quarterbacks, it was a great segue, Ryan. Listen to that. Look at that word, segue. We're going to talk about, and this is one you sent me as we prepare for the show. Ryan and I kind of go back and forth on subjects, and this was a great one he brought up, which was backup quarterbacks. As you've seen from the NFL this season, if you don't have a good backup quarterback, with the way and the rate, by the way, 30% rise in quarterback injuries in the league this year over the last 2 years, you're in trouble, right? We've seen it happen. We saw the great Jake Browning, Pac-12 kid, comes in and look what he does for the Bengals against the Jaguars down in Jacksonville. But overall, tell people your premise here, because I think it's right. It's not just hey, you got to have a guy in case anymore. It's part of the strategy of winning.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to me, Scott, how few teams have actually put an emphasis on that. And you see how their season's over if their top QB goes down. And look, there's never going to be anything perfect because the quarterback is the hardest position to play in all of sports. And there's 5 elite guys, 15 good guys, and then another 15 that can, I guess, play the position. But there's 200 and something college QBs every single year. Not all those going to the draft, but there's between 10 and 20 every year that go into the draft. And then you have all the vets. There's a lot of players that play the quarterback role. And so I think it's twofold, Scott, and I'd love to get your opinion. But one, actually emphasizing getting a competent backup QB. For instance, the Los Angeles Rams are here have never emphasized that since Sean McVay's been here. That's like they probably wouldn't even have a backup QB on their roster if they were allowed to. But two, actually allocating resources to develop that backup quarterback if things like this happen. Now I get it. When you now with the new league rules, there's less practice time. There's less padded practice. There's less on the field situations. So I get you got to give all those reps to your starter in order to give yourself a shot for a Super Bowl. But there's got to be a way, whether this is a new rule going back to the rules committee or whether this is off the field stuff or on your own time, developing some of these younger backup QBs so that when they get thrown into this position, they're actually competent. A, it'll be better for the NFL because it's not going to hurt the product because some of these backup quarterbacks are just hard to watch. And B, it keeps your team in it. And we've seen time and time again when teams have put an emphasis, a la the Philadelphia Eagles when they won the Super Bowl with Nick Foles. We've seen it across the board, teams that actually stay fairly competitive. Look at the Colts right now. The Colts are in playoff contention with Gardner Minshew, who I think everyone would agree is one of the top backup QBs out there.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'll toss it to you before going any further, but I just think it's fascinating how half the league, if not more, puts zero emphasis on any type of backup quarterback.
Absolutely. And you look at it this year, and you mentioned this as we were going back and forth in prep for the show about the number of quarterbacks. And I did a story on quarterback injuries this week up on sportsnaut.com, by the way, too. Go check that out if you haven't read it. You talk about there's been 68 different players who started quarterback in the NFL this year. Okay. Last year it was 52. Okay. Just to show you how much of a crazy year it's been for the quarterback position. But if you look at it, your premise, and I think you need to do some like long piece on this, Ryan, because I think you're onto something, which is the fact that the way the position has changed too in the NFL. Okay, you have to be mobile. You have to create plays outside the pocket, which is harder, makes it more difficult to make decisions, right? You have to think differently than a pocket quarterback does. 2, you're more susceptible to injury. As for that piece, I had Dr. David Chow, who you're familiar with, a former Chargers team doctor, now has his whole website around sports injuries and comments on media all over the place about sports injuries. I talked to him yesterday, and he told me, also think about it this way. You're a running back. or a wide receiver, you catch the ball, you're most likely going to get guys coming at you from a 180-degree angle, right? So you're a running back, you hold the ball on the outside, you run, a guy hits you from the front, yeah, maybe from the side a little bit, but basically the same. When you're a quarterback who runs, you now have people coming at you from behind, from the side, from the forward, from different angles, and so the injury possibility actually grows. Mm-hmm. So that said, you now have built a league where it benefits the passing sets, everything benefits the mobile quarterback. The mobile quarterback is going to be more injured. Doesn't matter. I'm not saying running quarterback, not the Cam Newton stuff where he wouldn't stop running, but just overall mobility. So if that's the case, to think about a quarterback, a mobile quarterback that plays 16, 17 games a year, that might start going away. And if that's the case, it bolsters your argument, which is you can't just have one. Yes, you have your franchise guy, but you need somebody behind him. And that might not be a guy who's as mobile. It might be a guy who comes in more of a pocket passer, has to get a game or two under his belt, can still win a game for you, but obviously not as good because of the money situation. But I think you're right. I think you cannot say that. I think that's why you'll see teams draft multiple quarterbacks, even if they get a guy. Like, so CJ Stroud's in Houston. Maybe they draft a guy in the 4th round next year as a young guy to go behind him, right?
Should.
Why wouldn't you?
Yeah, they should. And the other thing that this makes no sense to me, Scott, I don't get it. Maybe you have an answer for me. But you see these teams too, and Rams are an example, and so are the Minnesota Vikings, and there's others out there. Their QB goes down. They don't trust their backup enough, so they go and sign someone off the couch. Why was that guy not signed in the beginning and on your roster in training camp?
Yeah.
Like, what? The Rams played one game with Brett Rippon, who was their backup all year. It was a horrible game. They lost to the Packers 20-3. The very next week, they release him, go sign Carson Wentz off the couch. The Vikings lose Kirk Cousins. They immediately go and trade for Josh Dobbs. Like, why are these guys? Why are these not your backups already? If you have no confidence in your backup to do anything, and you can't tell me it's money, because Carson Wentz just signed a deal with the Rams for like $1.1 million. Brett Rippon was making $900K. It's $300,000 difference. Like, you can't tell me that. So that's something I will never understand. If you have no faith in your backup QB, then why not go get one that you have faith in? Why wait till you need one and then go bring him in off the streets and say, hey, you got to learn this playbook in 48 hours. Good luck.
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree. I think that's why you have to think about it and you have to plan for it. And that's your point, right? Is it's no longer just it's an emergency. It's a break glass if needed thing. No, it's hey, strategically, we got a guy like Jalen Hurts or whoever it may be who runs around a little bit. He's more mobile. And so we need somebody behind him in case he gets hurt. And this guy has to be capable. It can't just be a guy holding a clipboard and that's all he's going to do. Right.
Yep.
And if you don't have that and you get in that position, then you might miss out on making the playoffs. Like if Dobbs wasn't having, now I know the last couple of games have been a little different, but when Dobbs went to Minnesota from Arizona, and look what he did in Arizona, he beat the Cowboys, all that. But he goes to Minnesota. If he wouldn't have had those games, they're not in the playoffs hunt still. They're not there. Like if they don't have anybody who can play the position. So I think you look at that and you have to start to think about it as a strategy to say, okay, we're going to have 3 quarterbacks on the roster because you got the emergency quarterback thing and that person's on the practice squad and inactive most games. That's fine. But you have to have somebody that fits the offense that can come in, especially as you start to see these injuries go up. And I think the other thing here too is the immense pressure for success. So that's the other reason to have a backup. You might, I'm not giving up on Bryce Young yet, but let's just use him as an example. You're the Panthers. You grab him number 1 overall in the draft. Struggles his first year. If he goes into next year with a better team around him, a better coach, and they determine he's not it, you better have somebody behind him, right? Because not everybody's going to hit. I mean, how many first round quarterbacks don't make it? A lot. So you have to think of it in that way, and I think that's why you do it. I cover the Raiders, as you know. They drafted Aiden O'Connell, who's more of a statue quarterback. He's the old school, more of a pocket passer. He's a little more nimble than that, but not much. Yeah. They drafted him in the 4th round. People are like, oh, is he going to be the next quarterback? I'm like, no, but he's a guy you want to develop and have right there as number 2. Yeah. And he may prove me wrong. I don't know. But my point is, even if it's not the guy who's the most mobile guy, but if you can get and develop, you have to develop quarterback talent. I guess that's what I'm getting to. You have to develop quarterback talent, and it's not just your starter.
Yeah. And so here's what I would do if I'm the league. Part of me doesn't want the league to do anything because I think it's teams will start having to strategize. And I think that's a nice gamesmanship to actually have to force teams to use it as a strategy. But if I'm the league and I care about the product on the field, which, let's be honest, like having these terrible backups in is not a great product. Here's what I would do. So I like that they've, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of these roster things, if you know, because I think I got it, but I could be wrong. So I love that they changed that you can now have 3 quarterbacks on the active roster, and the third one doesn't count against your 40, whatever it is, 47 people or whatever. It's like a emergency, like you said, quarterback. So that's good. I would force, what's the practice squad now? 16 players?
16.
I would bump that to 18, and those last 2 mandatory 2 quarterbacks, because you can't tell me there's not enough guys that play the position. And you can't tell me there's not enough talent that can play the position. The front runner for the MVP was the last overall pick in Brock Purdy, and they just happened to develop him when he went to the right system. Obviously has a ton of talent around him. That's a different story. So you mandatory have to have 2 QBs on your practice squad plus the 3 on your active roster. So now you have 5 QBs in your system you can develop and build. Maybe that's overkill, some would say, but I think as long as you're developing guys correctly and they're getting the reps and they can do more, we're not just throwing darts at a wall on Wednesday, going and picking someone up off the streets because we've allocated that room in our building. I mean, you look at other sports, look at soccer in the Premier League, right? There's like 17 different offspring teams of all players that are training to get to that next level. Why the most important position in all of sports, do you have 3 on the entire team? So that's what I would do.
Not a bad idea. I mean, listen, I think, I mean, radical to add to, but I would say this. I would say that the development of players, and so we're talking about quarterbacks here because they are the most important position on the field in the NFL. But I think that applies to even other players, even if it's like 3 or 5 guys on your practice squad. Because right now, practice squad guys can be signed by other teams, right? So if you have somebody on your practice squad, you can no longer just hold on to them. If somebody wants to come sign them, they can pay them and they can leave, right? Because they're going to get an active roster spot elsewhere. But I will say this: I think that there's not a channel any longer in the NFL for development of players, and I think quarterback is the hardest position to play, right? Yep. So if the quarterback is the hardest position to play, your idea, that would be great because I can go get free agent undrafted rookie quarterbacks. I can go get a rookie quarterback I'd take in the 6th round, whatever, because he's got raw skill, but he might take 2 or 3 years to develop into an NFL player. And if I can put him on my practice squad, he's protected, and I can invest in him and see what we got, boy, that makes it better, right? And I think that would make quarterback play better in the league because when you do sometimes go to these backups, there's some of these teams, like you said, who don't think about it, have guys that shouldn't be in the league. I mean, they just shouldn't be. They're not good enough to play. But if they had a couple years to develop and learn, maybe they would be adequate. I'm not saying they're going to be superstars, but they'd be adequate enough to sub in for a game or a 2 or a half, whatever the need may be.
Yeah, because we all know it's no mystery. College is not doing these quarterbacks any favors. By the time they get to the NFL, most of them are so unprepared based on the college offenses and based on the defensive schemes they see and based on what they do pre-snap and based on the silly college rule. There's still no headsets. Everything's hand signals on the sideline. You get to the NFL, now you have headsets and these long play calls. I mean, in college, it's basically a 2-word play call because it's hand signals on the sideline. You get to the NFL, you get to Sean Payton system. Russell Wilson has to wear the wristband now because it's about 25 words on the play call. A lot of that is development and learning. And so if you add those 2 QB spots and maybe to make it more interesting, only one of them is protected. The other one can be taken by other teams. So you have to go back and forth of which one you're protecting. You're developing them. You're doing all these different things because how many great stories do we have in this league, Scott, of guys that came out of nowhere that if you have this, you might see more of that. I mean, the Kurt Warners, the Brock Purdy's, all these different storylines that as the way rosters are constructed, there's just not enough room for having quarterbacks that are unproven. But every year there's at least 10 in the draft and there's probably 30 more that go undrafted.
Right.
There's plenty of guys out there to get on rosters.
Right. And I mean, I know we all go to Brock Purdy and you're right. He's in the right system, got a lot of talent around him. But at the same time, it's hard. I did that story on our quarterbacks worse now than they were in previous years too. Like, is the play gone down? And there is certainly indication of that because we're in a lull. I mean, after the Brady, the Mannings, all those guys that were there, of course you're going to have a dip. They were generational players, Roethlisberger, River, all those guys. So, but when you look at it too, one of the things I found in talking to folks was that the development time we're talking about right here with these quarterbacks
Yep.
is so short. So, and not only that, but now with the collective bargaining, I'm all for player safety. You and I are on the same side on that. We always agree on that. Want to do whatever you can to protect players. But because they have limited opportunities for reps, and if you're a backup, it's even more limited. How do you expect to develop? You can't get better at anything unless you do it more. Now, Dr. Chow yesterday talked about virtual reality, and he said there's possibility there for guys to develop more since they can't do it on the field per se. I know it's not the same, but at least it's something.
Yeah.
But with your proposal, to me, that's the bigger thing. So a guy gets in more reps because they can have more practices because they have larger practice squads, whatever the rule could be. Then suddenly you can see a guy come from third on the practice squad to being the backup and being a capable backup, and maybe he develops into a starter. But because the NFL is a win now league, it always has been, but player development suffers, and the quarterback's the hardest position, just plain and simple.
Yeah. Yeah. And just the other side of that, or the final, I guess, point I can make of that too, that isn't going to change, but you have to be so quick as a quarterback to develop, but then there's also so much pressure on these coaches to win now too, as we just saw with Frank Reich getting fired and others, that they're pressuring their quarterback to make those plays too. Like in the past, you have a rookie quarterback, you make your offense as simple as possible, right? Like you run the ball more, you use your tight end a lot more as the outlet. You're making things easy for your quarterback. Now it's like, if you can't learn this now, well, it's either you or me. It's not going to be me. So we'll just find a new quarterback, or the franchise says we'll find a new coach. So the teams that can factor that in, get that right, develop a backup in case, and then if the league takes that step of adding more guys, and then like we talked about, I love how we're tying this all back together, Scott, as we talked about with the XFL and the USFL, if they actually do come to a deal, which there's been a lot of talk about having that be a true developmental league underneath them in the spring, well, then you get all those quarterbacks that are getting true game time play in the spring that now can be on your practice squad or backups in the fall, and vice versa. And so there's a lot of opportunity here. I don't think I'm that outlandish. I think a lot of this is common sense. They just need to make it go happen.
Yeah, no, exactly right. But then you get into the whole, the CBA is only 3 years now. So we got 5 more to go before they revise it. So I don't know. And that's the other point. But if I'm the players union, that makes sense because I get more guys in the union. I get more guys jobs. They're making money and they're paying dues, right? So maybe there's a win-win there, which there isn't always when the league is dealing with the players union. All right, good conversation there. Appreciate that. All right, we're going to move on now. Our last subject of today's show, which is the big game coming up this weekend between the Philadelphia Eagles and the Dallas Cowboys. Ryan, I have been hard on the Cowboys. The Cowboys haven't beat anybody. I know the same arguments used with Miami, but the Cowboys, Dak Prescott playing well. People want to say he's an MVP candidate. I will begrudgingly say he is if he's number 5 on that list, by the way, only because of what he's done and who he's faced. He's beat one team with a winning record, and that is the Seattle Seahawks. And they had to struggle to beat them. Now, they've also, the games they're supposed to win against these bad teams, they are winning, and they're winning by like 20 plus points or more. So they are playing well when they're supposed to, and their schedule is back-ended. So now we're going to see what they're really made of. And if they win against Philly and some of these other teams they got coming down the line, then I'll be a believer. But either way, they come in 9-3. The Eagles are 10-2. And this really is, it's a big divisional game, of course, a huge rivalry, the whole thing. When you look at this, though, I think both these teams, even though there's no question they're in the top 4 conversation in the NFC, this is a big game for both of them. They both kind of have something to prove, don't they?
100% for everything you just said. Because even the Eagles I think they've won bigger games. Obviously, they beat the Chiefs and some others like that, but all of them have come down to like the wire. They've had to like kind of get some luck go their way and stuff like that. And Jalen Hurts, some weeks looks like an MVP candidate, some weeks does not at all. And so that's a conversation. So yeah, I think it's a big prove it game. They're both very prideful teams, prideful organizations, prideful fan bases. So it should be a lot of fun. And, for the most part, they've both been fairly healthy. So we'll see how they can keep that going. But when you look at it in terms of just matchups, you have this really dynamic Philadelphia Eagles offense against a really, really good, powerful front and secondary in the Dallas Cowboys. And then on the opposite end, you have the Cowboys really, really good offense and the Eagles somewhat struggling defense. So based on just what we've seen and who they've played, I think the upper hand maybe goes to the Cowboys right now. But like you said, we haven't seen them do it against upper echelon talent and upper echelon teams. So how will they, react when they're playing this big divisional opponent and whatnot? So should be a great game. Should be a lot of fun. Obviously the fan bases love going against each other. So we talked last week about this budding rivalry between the Niners and Eagles. It's not a budding rivalry with the Cowboys and Eagles. That's a long, historic, one of the best in football. So a lot of fun when those two teams play. That's for sure.
Yeah, there's been a lot of hatred there. I mean, that division, of course, the Philly New York rivalry, the Philly Commanders rivalry, going back to when they were the Redskins. All of that is huge, and so that's why it's a big game. But it really is, because I think Philly's at that inflection point too. I really think so, because they, to your point about Hurts being hurt and the fact that, he's inconsistent, still the best quarterback they have. Clearly, I don't agree with David Carr that they should start Marcus Mariota. Crazy take. But nonetheless,
but they have a good backup quarterback, I guess. So there you go.
Yeah, there you go. So you look at that and you say, okay, Philly's in this weird spot, because I look at Philly and clearly one of the best teams in the NFL, but I don't think they're as good as last year. I think they've been inconsistent. The defense, they have trouble. We saw it against the 49ers, right? We saw how they had trouble keeping. Now, the 49ers, they have an all-star lineup. But CeeDee Lamb is going nuts right now. CeeDee Lamb is one of the best wide receivers in the game as we speak. And so they're going to have their hands full. They have had issues at linebacker. Of course, their defensive front has been very good, but at times it seems to go dark. It seems like they don't put pressure. And if they don't put pressure on Dak Prescott and get him out of his game, I think he tears them apart. But I do think either way you look at it, these teams are both very talented, so it's going to be a close game. I think it's going to be a high-scoring game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one thing I'll say about the Cowboys that I've been impressed with, and I'm with you. I'm not a full believer yet, and we don't even have to go way back in history, just based on since Dak has been there, because they haven't been able to get over that hump or win that big game. So until proven otherwise, I'm with you. But one thing I'll give them credit for, regardless of who they've played, and I said this about during the Seattle-Dallas game, and it was in reference to the Chargers and Kellen Moore, and Chargers fan base came with pitchforks to me, but it was just a simple fact. Kellen Moore leaves the Cowboys, mutual parting of ways between him and Mike McCarthy, and comes to the Chargers. The immediate thought was, wow, Cowboys really think with Mike McCarthy calling shots that they're in a better spot than they were with this guru in Kellen Moore. Kellen Moore comes to the Chargers. The thought was, wow, they're going to go from Joe Lombardi, who couldn't do anything with that offense, with Justin Herbert at the quarterback, and now it's Kellen Moore and Herbert, and that thing is going to take off. In terms of total offense, which is not the end-all be-all, there's a lot of different scenarios, but in terms of total offense, the Chargers' offense this year is worse under Kellen Moore than it was last year with Joe Lombardi. The Cowboys' offense is substantially better with just Mike McCarthy and not Kellen Moore. So I give them credit. I give Mike McCarthy credit for proving those doubters wrong. Again, some of that's schedule, some of that's health, a lot of other things, but a stat is a stat. A fact is a fact. And in total offense, they're better this year than they were last year with Kellen Moore. The Chargers are worse.
Great
so,
point.
They're doing something right. And part of that's the offensive line is playing lights out, which they've always put an emphasis on. They're not one of the few franchises that really emphasizes in the trenches, and they have both great fronts. And Dak is playing, I think, much better overall than he has in years past. So, they're doing things right.
Yeah, and he's limited turnovers, and I think that's huge for them. And listen, the Cowboys, you play the schedule you have. That's not, people will use schedule against, and we're talking about that they haven't beaten anybody, and it's true, but it's not their fault. It's not like Alabama, who plays, Sisters of the Poor in November before they get
Chattanooga,
the SEC championship, right?
Oh my!
It's not like that. It's that you don't have control. You have the schedule you have, but now that they will get a test here at the end of the season. So if they are one of the best teams in the NFL, they'll prove it, and I'll give them credit for it, because that's the way it goes. And the same goes for the Eagles, who I think are still one of the best teams. But they're in this weird spot where it's like they kind of got to figure a couple things out as they get this run. You want to be a hot team going into the playoffs, because in January anything can happen. So you want to be there. And so this game will be good. And I think even if the Eagles lose this game, but they play well and it's just one of those back and forth kind of affairs, That's fine too, right? It's not the end of the world for the Eagles. They'll hate losing to the Cowboys and losing 2 in a row. But sometimes that can help you down the stretch too, as you kind of get grounded and then you pop back right up. So we'll see. But either way, going to be fun, going to be an incredible game. You can find all coverage you want. We're doing a ton of coverage this week on this game up on sportsnaut.com. So make sure you do that as well. Ryan, any parting shots, anything else on your mind?
Yeah, one more just quick point on that. Sorry.
That's okay.
We talked about it a couple weeks ago, but I'll just bring it up again. And I completely agree. They haven't played really anyone yet. And I think that is definitely worth taking into account. The one thing I'll say though, and I think the NFL is very different in this in college, is, playing a bad Cardinals team in the NFL is very different than playing Chattanooga in November like Alabama did, right? Like it's still an NFL roster, still an NFL team. And 2 or whatever year it was, 2021, when Tom Brady went down to Tampa Bay and they won that Super Bowl in his first year. Going into the playoffs, that Buccaneers team had only beaten one team that had an above 500 record. They had only one victory over a winning team. Got to the playoffs, didn't matter. They ended up winning the Super Bowl. So I'm not saying that shouldn't be accounted for, but sometimes you just need to get to the dance and then get hot at the right time and get the favorable matchups, and it doesn't matter. Will they go down as maybe the greatest NFL team of all time? Probably not.
Doesn't matter.
But they have their name on the Lombardi, so
you win it. You get the ring.
Yeah,
and I agree with you. I think there's good examples. You go back to the late 70s or was it 80 when the Raiders beat the Eagles. They were the first wild card team to get to the Super Bowl, and they won it. So You're right. I think that's the important thing. So you look at some of these teams, even like a Buffalo who's been kind of down and is kind of their windows closed a little bit on them. Hey, you get hot, you have a good quarterback, you have a couple star players, and you just catch somebody on a day or you catch somebody with matchups, and the whole thing can change. So yeah, there's no definites in this league because there's so much talent everywhere, and you just never know what's going on. But Ryan, I know as we move towards the playoffs here, obviously the Chargers still, from an LA perspective, still in the conversation. The Rams want to be in the conversation too. How does that whole LA football situation look for the last 5 weeks of the season here?
Yeah, Chargers going to be tough. They got the Broncos twice, who obviously the Broncos fell to the Texans, but they're still above them at 6-6, and they play them this weekend. I should be at that game at SoFi. And they get the Raiders once. Trying to think of their whole schedule, but it's an uphill climb for them with their record where they're at 5-7. So I don't expect them to all of a sudden just become this playoff caliber team. Even last week with the win, they won 6-0 against the Patriots, and the offense could do absolutely nothing. So I'm not too confident they'll get it right. The Rams, on the other hand, have been a very fun team. I know they're 6-6, but a 3-game win streak, have come off some good wins. I know it was a Flacco-led Browns team, but still a very good defense that they ended up putting up. They put up 34 points because they got a safety, so 36 total. But the offense in that fourth quarter really took fire. And, the Puka Nacua story, who I think should be up for Rookie of the Year, leading all rookie receivers. Kyron Williams, as you know well, out of Notre Dame, has been such a tremendous back for them when he's been healthy. And Stafford's playing at an elite level. So this Rams team is a fun team. It was seen as a rebuild year or a remodel year, and yet they may make the playoffs. So it's exciting, and I think Coach McVay needs to be in the Coach of the Year candidate talks.
Yeah, I was going to say that too, because I think you look at some of the Coach of the Year, so many people look at the teams like the Lions, and Dan Campbell has done a great job, don't get me wrong, but I look at the teams that were supposed to be nothing and say, you mentioned McVay, you also mentioned DeMeco Ryans in Houston. Obviously helps that he got a quarterback that is a Rookie of the Year candidate too. But then you look at Shane Steichen with the Colts and O'Connell with the Vikings. Like these young, it's good to see, to me, the young coaches, even though McVay still young. I know he's been in the league a little bit longer. He's won a Super Bowl, but still, he's still a young guy. The new generation of coaches doing so well and taking tough opportunity. I mean, in Indianapolis, you lose your top draft pick, your quarterback, to a knee injury. You get Minshew in there. Again, great signing for a backup quarterback. And look what they've done. Minnesota's kept it together. The Rams have kept it together. They're fun to watch. And even they're not as good, and they're not even in the playoff hunt. But what Gannon has done down in Arizona with the Cardinals is an amazing coaching job. Those guys play hard. It's almost like watching a college team, because they're like that FBS school playing the FCS school, and suddenly they have no chance to beat this team, but they play hard enough to make it close. And so and of course they've stolen a couple wins, including from the Cowboys. So it's fun to watch those coaches, and there needs to be a way to recognize those guys. If it's not Coach of the Year award, it's something. But clearly, those coaches are doing the right thing with less than a stellar roster. So you got to appreciate it. But I appreciate the rundown there. And of course, if you're interested in any of that, make sure you check out the LA Football Network, a part of Sportsnaut here as well. And you'll see Ryan here doing videos and all over the place for Sportsnaut as well. So it's all good stuff. My friend, it's always fun to chop it up with you. We appreciate it. And we will see you next week.
Thanks, man. Always a pleasure. See you next week.
All right. So for Ryan Dyrud, I'm Scott Gulbransen. Do us a favor. Make sure you subscribe to the channel here and share it with your friends. Have them come over. We love doing this show. We'll continue to evolve it and have fun. Would love you in the chat so we can answer your questions and mix it up with you as well. Make sure you check out sportsnaut.com as we always have great football coverage up on the website. So for all of us here, wishing you the best rest of your week and have a great, great football week.